Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1879. The wind cut sharp through the sagebrush as the moon hung low, and Odessa Neal ran. Her bare feet slapped the cold dirt, dress torn at the thigh, blood drying on her lip. The sound of hooves echoed far behind, but her ears were ringing too loud to tell how far. She did not look back. Not once. The barn had been her last hiding place, but when the door creaked open and she saw his boots cross the threshold, she bolted through the back, into the dark stretch of land beyond the ranch. Odessa did not know how long she ran before her knees gave out and she collapsed into a shallow ditch. Her chest burned. Her palms were scraped raw. She curled into herself, shaking, dirt pressed to her cheek. Her heart beat like a drum against her ribs. A soft crunch of hooves slowed on the trail above. A deep voice, low and steady, cut through the night. "Hey," he said. "You are safe now." She flinched, gasped, tried to scrabble away, but a warm blanket dropped over her shoulders before she could move. She looked up, blinking through tears and dirt. The cowboy dismounted, slow and careful, like he was approaching a spooked colt. He crouched beside her. "You are safe now," he repeated, quieter. "I am not going to hurt you." He had kind eyes. That was the first thing she noticed. Brown like burnt maple, with crow's feet at the corners. His hat was dusted white from the trail, and his coat was worn but clean. A rifle was slung behind his shoulder, but his hands stayed open. "Can you stand?" he asked. Odessa tried. Her legs gave under her, and she gritted her teeth, humiliated. "All right," he said gently. "I have you." He scooped her up, strong arms steady beneath her knees and back. She pressed her face into his shirt without thinking. He smelled like leather and horses and something faintly sweet, like tobacco leaves left in the sun. "What is your name?" he asked, carrying her to his horse. She hesitated, then whispered, "Odessa Neal." "I am Vaughn Prescott," he said. "Let's get you home." She let herself be lifted into the saddle, and he climbed up behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. Odessa did not question where he was taking her. She just let her head rest against his chest as they rode, the rhythm of the horse lulling her eyes half shut. They reached a small cabin tucked between cottonwood trees, far from the town. Vaughn swung down and lifted her again without a word. The porch light, just a lantern, glowed soft yellow. He pushed through the door with his shoulder and carried her straight to a narrow bed in the corner. "You are hurt," he said, kneeling beside her. "Let me look." She nodded, numb. Vaughn pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, then fetched warm water from the stove and a cloth. He cleaned the cut on her lip, his touch gentle, his jaw tight. "Who did this?" he asked. "My uncle," she said, voice cracking. "He was going to sell me off. I heard him talking to a man. I ran." Vaughn's mouth pressed into a hard line. "I had nowhere to go," she whispered. "You do now," he said. "You stay here. Nobody is going to touch you." She blinked at him, disbelieving. "Why would you help me?" He stood and pulled a folded quilt from the chest at the end of the bed. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "And because I do not look away when someone is in trouble. That is not how I was raised." His voice was solid, like the ground under her feet. Odessa let herself lie back against the pillow. Her body ached, her eyes stung, but for the first time in days she felt safe. Vaughn sat in the chair beside the stove, one leg crossed over the other, watching the fire. He did not ask more questions. He just stayed. She slept. When she woke, the morning light painted the wooden walls amber. She sat up slowly, wincing at the bruises along her ribs. Vaughn was outside chopping wood, shirt sleeves rolled up, the swing of his axe steady and sure. She opened the door and stepped outside, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Vaughn looked up and offered a small nod. "I can help," she said, voice still rough. "You need rest," he replied. "I do not want to lie down anymore." He studied her for a moment, then handed her a smaller log. "You hold." I split. So they worked like that, quiet, the sound of the axe and the crack of wood filling the air. Odessa's fingers trembled, but she held each log firm. When they stopped for a break, Vaughn handed her a tin cup of coffee. She cupped it in both hands, grateful for the heat. "I will take you into town tomorrow," he said. "Get you some fresh clothes, boots that fit." She looked down at her bare, scratched feet. "You do not have to do all this." "I know," he said simply. She stared into her cup. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not found me." "You never have to know," he said. She looked up. His eyes were still kind, still steady. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. He leaned against the porch rail. "Left Texas 5 years ago. Army did not suit me. Bought this plot with what pay I had. Been fixing it up ever since." "Do you ever get lonely?" He tilted his head. "Sometimes." Odessa sipped her coffee, her heart quiet for the first time in weeks. That night she helped him cook beans and cornbread. They ate by the fire. She caught him watching her, not with pity but with a quiet warmth that curled in her chest. When she stood to go to the bed, she paused. "Thank you," she said. Vaughn gave a small nod. "You are safe now, Odessa." She believed him. And for the first time she let herself hope. Odessa stood at the washbasin near the window, sleeves rolled to her elbows, brushing wet hair from her face with one hand while the other poured water from the basin pitcher. The morning light filtered through the cotton curtains, quiet and honey-colored. She hadn't asked to stay longer, and Vaughn hadn't told her to go. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it simply held. Outside, Vaughn was oiling the hinges on the barn door. The air smelled of pine pitch and frost-bitten grass. Odessa stepped out, the hem of her new skirt brushing her boots. The clothes had come from a widow Vaughn knew down in Elk Hollow, traded for a sack of beans and a patch of mule leather. She hadn't asked why he kept to himself, and he hadn't offered. That, too, was part of the quiet. "You know how to milk?" Vaughn asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've done it before." "She'll test your patience," he said, nodding toward the brown cow in the pen. "But she's fair if you're consistent." Odessa climbed the fence and crossed the pen with slow steps. The cow flicked an ear but didn't move. Odessa set the stool, steadied the pail, and got to work, her face still and focused. Vaughn watched from the fence, arms folded, expression unreadable. "I figure I can help with more than the cow," she said once she'd finished, carrying the full pail toward him. "I can mend worn shirts and patch a saddle if you show me how." He took the pail from her. "You don't owe me anything." "I didn't say I did." "I said I could help." He considered that, then gave a single nod. "All right." They spent the afternoon in the lean-to behind the barn, where Vaughn kept a workbench and a row of tools hung with care. Odessa watched him strip old leather from a bridle, his hands precise. She handled the scraps, testing the grain with her fingers. "Where'd you learn to do this?" "My father was a mule skinner, taught me how to keep things mended so we didn't go without." He handed her a square of saddle soap. "You clean that one." "I'll show you the stitching when it's ready." She worked with quiet diligence, and when the sun dipped behind the hills, they made supper together without speaking. The stillness wasn't strained, it was the kind that settled into your bones and made you feel steady for the first time in too long. Later they sat on the porch, 2 chairs angled toward the dry creek. Odessa wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, watching the dusk settle over the land. "You ever wonder if you ended up where you were supposed to?" she asked. Vaughn didn't look at her. "I used to think I missed the place meant for me, then I stopped thinking in those terms." "Why?" "Because the land doesn't care what you hoped for, it just gives what it gives. You take it or you don't." She pulled the shawl tighter. "I thought I'd marry a man who read by lamplight and kept a garden, someone who'd ask before touching my hand." His voice was quiet. "Most men don't get taught how to be gentle." "I know," she said. "That's why it surprised me when you were." They sat in silence. A nighthawk called from beyond the trees. "You planning to stay through winter?" he asked finally. "I haven't thought that far," she said, "but I'm not looking to leave." He gave a slow nod, like he understood something she hadn't quite said aloud. The fire inside burned low by the time they went in. Odessa knelt by the hearth, adding another log. Vaughn handed her the poker. "You can have the bed tonight," she said. "I'm fine by the fire." "I made the bed for you," he said. "That hasn't changed." She stood slowly, meeting his eyes. "You trust me in your home, I trust you to know what's fair." That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the soft creak of the chair where Vaughn sat, boots off, reading by lantern light. the faint scratch of a page turning, the occasional shift of weight. She didn't feel watched. She felt seen, and for the first time in her life, that didn't scare her. The first snow came quiet and early, brushing the cottonwoods in soft white and muting the world beneath it. Odessa stood at the edge of the barn, arms crossed, breath clouding the air as she watched the flakes drift down. Vaughn was on the roof, hammering a fresh layer of pitch shingles into place, his breath steady, his coat dusted with snow. "You'll freeze up there," she called. He paused mid-swing. "Not if I finish before sundown. You always work like the wind's chasing you." He glanced down, smiled faintly. "Better to stay ahead of the cold." She stepped back inside, the smell of stew already thick in the room. She stirred it with a wooden spoon, her fingers pink from the cold. The beans were soft, the rabbit tender. She'd trapped it herself that morning, setting the snare a ways up the ridge where the tracks ran clean through the brush. Vaughn hadn't said much when she came back with it, just helped skin and dress it without a word. By dusk, the roof was sealed, the light was dim, and the stew was ladled into 2 tin bowls. They ate by the hearth, the windows iced at the corners. "I found something in the storage chest earlier," she said between bites. "A fiddle case." Vaughn didn't look up. "Belonged to my mother. You play?" "I used to." She laid her spoon down. "Will you?" His jaw worked for a moment before he rose and crossed to the chest, lifting the case with both hands. He opened it slow, almost reverent, and drew out the old fiddle. It was worn, but the strings looked fresh. "I change them every spring," he said, as though explaining to himself. He tucked it beneath his chin, drew the bow once across the strings. The sound was thin at first, rusty with disuse, but then it settled into something warm and haunted. Odessa folded her hands in her lap, heart stilling as the tune bent into a slow, aching waltz. He played until the last note faded into the fire's hiss. "You learned from her?" she asked. He set it gently back in the case. "She taught me when I was small." "Played every Sunday after supper." Odessa's voice dropped. "Was she kind?" He nodded once. "And tougher than anyone expected." She turned toward the window, her eyes catching the faint trail of smoke rising from the chimney. "My mother died when I was 12. Fever took her in 2 days." He didn't answer, but the silence felt like something held, not ignored. "I think about her most when it's cold," Odessa said. "I used to sleep beside the stove, and she'd wrap my hands in scraps of wool." Vaughn stood and poured the last coffee from the kettle. "I've got scraps if your hands ever need warming." She looked up, and something passed between them unspoken, but understood. The next morning, Vaughn was already outside splitting kindling when Odessa stepped into the yard. She carried a tin box wrapped in an old apron. "What's that?" he asked, not stopping. "Sourdough starter. I made it from flour and snowmelt. Thought I'd try my hand at bread." He set the axe down. "You're full of surprises." "I had to be," she said, brushing snow off a bench. "When folks only see you as trouble, you learn to be useful before you're thrown out." Vaughn sat across from her, rubbing his hands together to chase the cold. "You think that's how I see you?" She didn't answer right away. "No, that's the strange part." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You ever been on your own before?" She stared out at the bare trees. "Not like this, not where I could breathe." "Then breathe," he said. "You're not being looked at here, you're being seen." Her throat tightened. "That's a different kind of weight. I'll help you carry it." She didn't speak, but she reached across the bench and laid her hand over his. His fingers were rough from work, warm from the axe handle, and they didn't pull away. That evening they kneaded dough together in the kitchen. His hands were too heavy for the task and hers too light, but between them the dough took shape. It rose by the fire as sleet tapped against the windows. They watched it from their chairs, her head tilted toward his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. And when the bread came out of the oven, golden and cracked, they broke it together and ate in silence, sharing something neither one named. The snow fell through the night, draping the land in quiet. Inside the cabin, their hearts settled into rhythm, not rushed, not spoken, just steady and known. By mid-December, the sky had turned slate and low, pressing close to the land. The drifts climbed past the porch rail, and the world beyond the cabin took on a hush that felt deeper than silence. Vaughn had built a sled for hauling firewood, and Odessa stitched wool into mittens from the lining of an old coat. They moved around each other with an ease that had grown, not from talk, but from the way they remembered what the other needed before it was asked. One afternoon, Vaughn returned from checking the trapline with a thin red streak on his coat sleeve. Odessa saw it the moment he stepped through the door. "What happened?" she said, moving toward him. "Fox got clever. Bolts snapped late." "I caught the edge of it." She took his arm without asking, guiding him to the table. "You need to let me clean it. It's nothing. Let me decide that." His coat hit the floor with a heavy thud, and he sat down without protest as she rolled up his sleeve. The gash was shallow but long, and the blood had dried in a crust along the edge of the fabric. She brought the basin over and worked in silence, her hands as steady as they'd been with the fiddle strings. The cut stung as she cleaned it, but he didn't flinch. "You've done this before," he said. "My uncle used to come home with all kinds of scrapes. Half the time he drank through the pain. The other half he hollered. He ever thank you?" "No, but I stopped expecting it." She wrapped the wound with a strip of muslin, her brow furrowed. "You don't talk about him much," Vaughn said, voice low. "I did enough surviving under his roof. I won't let him take up space in my mind now." She tied the bandage tight and sat back. "You'll be fine, but no more reaching into traps barehanded." "I'll mind you," he said. "Seems you know what you're doing." Odessa stood and rinsed her hands. "I had to learn fast, not for care's sake, just to get by. Still, you do it with care now." That night she didn't retreat to the bed early, and he didn't reach for a book. They sat together at the table, the oil lamp between them. Outside, the snow whispered against the windowpane. Odessa traced a circle on the wood grain with her finger. "Did you ever think about marrying?" she asked. Vaughn didn't shift. "Once. Before the war." "What happened?" "She married someone else before I came back. I don't blame her. Took me too long to get home." Odessa watched the flame flicker. "I used to think marriage was something that happened to you like a storm you didn't get to escape." Vaughn met her eyes. "What do you think now?" "I think it could be something you choose, if you're lucky." He reached across the table, slow and sure, and laid his hand over hers. She turned her palm up to meet his. "This house was never meant to hold just one person," he said. "I built it hoping I'd have someone to share it with." Odessa's breath caught in her throat. "I've never had a place that felt like mine. You do now." When she leaned forward, it wasn't tentative. It was quiet, certain, like every word they hadn't said had been building toward this one moment. Her lips met his, and he kissed her back with the kind of patience that said he'd wait forever if he had to. Later, she stood before the hearth, his arms around her waist, the fire warming her front and his breath warming her neck. "You still sure?" he asked, voice near her ear. "I am." Vaughn pressed his forehead to her shoulder. "Then I'll ask when the snow melts, proper." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "You already have my answer." Outside, the storm deepened, but inside, the world was built of warmth and breath and something stronger than either of them had ever known alone. By early March, the wind had changed. It no longer bit. It carried the scent of thawing earth and wet bark, and the creek near the ridge had begun to murmur again beneath the melting snow. Odessa stood barefoot at the edge of the porch, her toes pressed to the patch of ground where the sun had cleared away the last crust of ice. The hem of her skirt fluttered against her calves. Vaughn leaned against the doorframe behind her, arms crossed, watching quietly. "I never noticed how loud the silence was until it started to lift," she said. He stepped down beside her, boots sinking into the softening soil. "You learn its shape when it's all you have." She turned to him. "Do you miss Texas?" He took his time answering. "I miss what I thought it was, but not the leaving." Odessa nodded. "I used to dream of places I'd never seen. Somewhere past the next ridge where no one knew what I'd come from." "You're past the ridge now." She looked up at him, the sun catching the line of his jaw. "I know." That afternoon, Vaughn hitched the team and drove them into Elk Hollow. The trail was muddy, the wagon jostling over ruts and half-thawed stones. Odessa rode beside him, gloved hands folded in her lap. They didn't speak much, just shared the space between them, the quiet of two people with nothing left to prove. At the general store, Mrs. Hargrave set aside 3 bolts of muslin and a tin of lye soap. Odessa thanked her, voice steady. No one stared this time, no one whispered. Vaughn's presence beside her was calm and solid, and she wore it like a second coat. Afterward, they stopped at the church. Vaughn spoke with Reverend Alcott behind the vestibule while Odessa ran her fingers over the worn edge of a pew. When he returned, he handed her a folded slip of paper. April 7th, he said. She traced the ink with her thumb. That's soon. I've waited longer than I meant to, he said. Don't see why we should wait longer still. She reached for his hand. Neither do I. That night they lay side by side in the cabin, the storm lantern flickering low. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm curled around her back. I don't have anything fine to wear, she said, voice barely above a whisper. You'll wear your name, he answered. That's all I ever wanted. The weeks passed quickly after that. Odessa mended the seams of her best dress, stitching pale blue thread into the cuffs. Vaughn built a trellis for early peas behind the barn and cleared brush from the path to the creek. They rose with the sun, worked side by side, and ended each day with the fire low and their feet tangled beneath the quilt. On the morning of the 7th, the valley woke to birdsong. The snow had vanished from the fields, and the cottonwoods were swelling with sap. Odessa stood before the mirror by the washbasin, twisting her hair into a braid wrapped tight around her crown. Her dress was pressed clean, and a ribbon the color of wild violets tied at her collar. When she stepped outside, Vaughn was waiting in his Sunday shirt, sleeves rolled but collar fastened. His hair was combed back, his boots buffed. He held out his hand. You ready? He asked. She slipped her fingers through his. I've been ready since the first snow. The ride to the church was quiet, save for the creak of the wagon and the crunch of gravel under wheel. Reverend Alcott met them at the door. Inside, the pews were mostly empty, just the Hargraves, the blacksmith and his wife, and a pair of ranch hands Vaughn had traded with the past winter. No one made a fuss. No one needed to. They stood at the altar, hands joined. The vows were spoken without hesitation. Odessa's voice did not tremble. Vaughn's gaze never left hers. When it was done and they were turned toward the door, the sun broke through the high windows and spilled across the wooden floor in gold. They didn't have a supper or a dance. They drove home, hand in hand, and shared coffee on the porch as the evening settled in. The world was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. That night they undressed without shyness. His hands found the buttons of her dress, hers the tie at his trousers. There was no rush, no fear, just the slow unfolding of trust built one moment at a time. He kissed the inside of her wrist before he lay beside her. She curled against his chest, the hush of his breath a steady rhythm beneath her cheek. You still think about the place you were meant for? He asked. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with warmth. No, she said. I'm living in it. The spring came full, then summer in its quiet heat. Odessa planted beans and squash along the fence while Vaughn repaired the roof of the smokehouse. They built a second coop behind the barn. She read aloud in the evenings from the books he'd kept in a crate beneath the bed stories of far-off places, though neither of them longed for them anymore. By the time the first frost returned, Odessa's belly had begun to swell. Vaughn kissed her there each night before sleep, his hand resting firm across the curve of new life. She laughed more now, low and quiet, but often. He smiled more too, though never louder than the wind. They spent the second winter with nothing lacking. The wood was stacked high, the pantry full. And in the early days of April, a baby girl was born in the cabin, her skin pink with life, her breath strong. They named her Clara. Vaughn carved her a cradle from pine. Odessa sewed her blankets from the scraps of their life together. Years passed. The cabin weathered, and so did they, but not in ways that wore them down. They grew into the land like roots, steady, unseen, but deep. And every day, as the sun rose behind the ridge and lit the fields in quiet gold, They woke beside each other with nothing held back, nothing hidden. Two souls who had once lived with ghosts, now warmed by the living, by the tender, and by the true. They had found their forever, not in grand declarations or fortune, but in the daily choosing, in the shared breath and the steady hand. They never needed more, and they never wanted it.